The conclave of the Lumina convened not in a hall of stone or steel, but within a symphony of solidified light. It was a chamber woven from captured starlight and nebular gases, a place of impossible beauty where gravity itself was a sculpted art form. Here, beings of pure, shimmering energy glided through the air, their forms fluid and ever-changing, their thoughts resonating as harmonious chimes that filled the celestial space. They were the Lumina, the self-appointed artists of the cosmos, and for millennia, they had pruned the chaotic garden of the galaxy, racing what they deemed discordant and cultivating what they saw as beautiful. At the heart of this luminous assembly floated Elder Kalis, his form a brilliant, searing gold, a testament to his age and influence. He was a master weaver, one who could manipulate the very fabric of space-time with the ease a painter wields a brush. His gaze was fixed upon a holographic projection hanging in the center of the conclave, a swirling, chaotic smear of deep blue and angry red. It was the sector of space currently occupied by the nascent, rapidly expanding human race. "Behold this blemish," Kalis chimed, his tone a melody of profound disappointment that echoed through the consciousness of every Lumina present. For centuries, we have observed it spread, a frantic, disordered growth, like a mold upon a perfect canvas. They call themselves humanity. Their worlds are a cacophony of crude alloys and chemical exhaust. Their art is noise. Their ambition is consumption. They do not build, they scar. They do not create, they merely replicate. This chaotic energy, this ugliness, is an affront to the great composition we have so patiently crafted. A soft, dissenting chord, a minor key in the grand symphony, emanated from the periphery. It was Lyra, a younger Lumina whose form was a gentle, iridescent lavender. She was a keeper of histories, a scholar who delved into the fragmented records of races long since corrected by the Lumina's grand design. Elder Kalis, her chime was respectful but firm. Your assessment of their aesthetic is, as always, Brené's, precise. But my studies suggest a dissonance we may be misinterpreting. Their crudeness may not be a weakness, but a different form of strength. She projected her own findings alongside Kalis's display, a dark, empty patch of space within the Orion Spur. I speak of the Great Silence. The archives record that the Vorlog, a warrior race of considerable might, ventured into this same sector 3 centuries ago. They were a species that lived for conquest. Yet after initiating their invasion of the fledgling human colonies, they simply vanished. Our records dismiss it as a stellar cataclysm or an internal collapse, but the Vorlog were too resilient for such fates. The data fragments I recovered speak not of disaster, but of a terror that consumed them from within. They spoke of human tactics that defied honor, logic, and even self-preservation. They spoke of an enemy that did not fight to conquer, but to utterly and completely eradicate a threat. Kalis turned his golden light upon her, a gesture of immense condescension. Youthful sentiment, Keeper Lyra. You see phantoms in the static of forgotten history. The Vorlog were brutes who likely destroyed themselves in their own savage fury. You mistake their incompetence for human capability. These humans are ephemeral. Their lives are brutish and short. Their technology rudimentary. They hurl metal slugs through chemical explosions and harness the clumsy power of fission. We weave light. We command gravity. We can unmake a star with a thought. To compare their chaotic thrashing to a genuine threat is to equate a child's tantrum with a supernova. And he turned back to the conclave, his light flaring with righteous conviction. We are the gardeners of this universe. It is not an act of cruelty to pull a weed. It is an act of love for the garden. We will not descend upon them with fire and fury, for that is their language, their crude dialect of existence. Ours will be a cleansing of sublime beauty. We will unweave their worlds, dissolve their fleets, and return their sector to the pristine silence it once held. Their end will be an elegant, silent erasure, a final, perfect brushstroke. The conclave resonated with a powerful, harmonious chord of agreement. Lyra's dissenting note was drowned in the overwhelming symphony of purpose. The Lumina, secure in their immeasurable superiority, could not conceive of a reality where their vision of perfection could be challenged by something so profoundly imperfect. And so, the cleansing fleet was commissioned. It was not an armada in the human sense of the word. It was a flotilla of living sculptures, ships crafted from solidified light and crystalline energy that moved through the void, not by propulsion, but by bending space around them. They were silent, graceful, and more deadly than any weapon humanity could imagine. At its head was the Stellarch, Kalus's personal vessel, a magnificent creation that resembled a celestial orchid blooming in the dark of space. His chosen target was a world the humans called Haven, a major colonial hub, a planet teeming with industry, art, and life. To the Lumina scanners, it was the epicenter of the human blemish, a world of sprawling, asymmetrical cities shrouded in a haze of their own making. Kalus believed that a singularly overwhelming demonstration of Lumina power here would shatter the collective human spirit. They were, he reasoned, a fragile species, obsessed with their own brief mortality. The sight of their most vibrant world being effortlessly erased would surely break them, causing the rest of their chaotic civilization to crumble without a fight. He envisioned the cleansing as a quick, clean, and beautiful process. On Haven, life continued in its messy, vibrant, and utterly human way. In the orbital command station high above the planet, grizzled Defense Commander Marcus Thorne stared at his tactical display, nursing a cup of coffee that was more stimulant than beverage. The screen was a chaotic dance of icons representing thousands of ships' cargo haulers, passenger liners, asteroid miners, and military patrols all weaving through the system's busy space lanes. For the third time in as many hours, a sensor ghost flickered at the far edge of the system, a faint anomaly that his systems couldn't resolve. It registered as a gravitational distortion, but without a corresponding energy signature or transponder signal. Protocol dictated it was a sensor glitch, a phantom caused by a passing solar flare or a gravimetric echo from the nearby gas giant. He logged it and dismissed it, his mind already on a looming budget dispute with the colonial administration. The idea that a hostile fleet could approach his world undetected was laughable. Their long-range sensors could spot a conventional FTL drive signature from light years away. They would have days, if not weeks, of warning before any known hostile power could reach them. The thought that something could exist outside their understanding of physics never even entered his mind. Then, the universe bloomed. Without a sound, without a tear in the fabric of space, the Lumina cleansing fleet arrived. They did not drop out of hyperspace with a violent flash. They simply unfolded into existence, their crystalline forms catching the light of Haven's sun like a cluster of impossible jewels. On the command deck of the Stellarch, Kalus watched the planet fill his view screen. He felt a serene sense of purpose, the calm focus of a master artist about to begin his work. He saw the crude orbital platforms and armored defense stations circling the planet, clumsy iron sentinels bristling with projectile weapons. He saw them as scribbles on his canvas, imperfections to be removed before the true work could begin. He did not issue a command with his voice. He simply projected his will, a single, perfect note of intent that resonated through his fleet. Begin the erasure, the note sang. From the crystalline ships, no missiles launched, no energy beams lanced out. Instead, focused rays of pure, coherent light touched each of Haven's orbital defenses. There were no explosions, no fireballs, no debris. The stations and the ships guarding them simply dissolved. Metal, ceramic, fuel, and human bodies were unwoven at a molecular level, reverting to a cloud of incandescent, shimmering particles that hung in orbit for a moment before dissipating into the void. It was a silent, beautiful, and utterly terrifying display of power. Aboard Haven's orbital command, 1,000 alarms screamed at once. Marcus Thorne spun around as his entire defense grid vanished from the tactical display. One moment, it was there, a robust network of steel and fury he had spent 20 years building. The next, it was gone. Not redlined, not destroyed, simply absent. "Report!" he roared, his heart pounding against his ribs. "What was that? What hit us?" The sensor chief stared at his console, his face pale with disbelief. "Nothing, sir," he stammered. "There was no incoming fire, no energy signatures, no FTL wakes. They just ceased to exist." And Thorne's gaze was drawn to the main view screen, which now showed the impossible fleet hanging in the sky above his world. They were beautiful, silent, and utterly alien. A chill colder than the void of space crept down his spine. This wasn't an attack. This was an execution. Kalis, satisfied with the opening stroke, broadcast his message to the planet below. It wasn't a demand for surrender in any language. It was a series of complex melodic chimes, a harmonic sequence of profound beauty and overwhelming power designed to communicate the futility of resistance. It was the sound of inevitability, the song of a god telling mortals that their time was over. On the bridge, Thorne listened to the alien melody washing over the comms, a sound that was both enchanting and horrifying. He couldn't understand the notes, but he understood the message perfectly. This was a power beyond his comprehension, a force that saw his world not as a prize to be conquered, but as a flaw to be corrected. He knew, in that moment, that surrender was not an option being offered. It was a choice they would never make anyway. He keyed the planetary broadcast channel, his voice rough but steady. "All ground forces, this is command. We are under attack by an unknown hostile. All defense protocols are now active. Objective survival. Hold the line. Make them bleed for every inch." In the silent beauty of space, the artist had made his first stroke, expecting the canvas to yield. He had no way of knowing that this canvas, this ugly, chaotic, human canvas, would fight back with a fury that would smear his perfect composition with blood and fire. From the celestial orchid of the Stellarch, Kalis observed the world of Haven not as a battlefield, but as a canvas awaiting purification. His will, a current of pure intent, flowed through the cleansing fleet, and the erasure of the human presence began. It was a process of sublime, silent beauty. Rays of coherent light, more concept than energy, descended upon the planet's surface. They did not burn or blast. They unwove. The crude, angular geometry of a human city would shimmer, its edges blurring as if seen through heated air. Then, block by block, the structures would lose cohesion, their atoms forgetting the bonds that held them together, dissolving into a silent, upward drifting cascade of luminous moats. Forests planted in rigid, unnatural rows, vast factory complexes belching chemical smoke, Sprawling transportation networks scarring the landscape all were touched by the light and returned to a state of pristine, elemental simplicity. To Kalis, it was the ultimate act of aesthetic restoration. He was not destroying a people. He was healing a world, smoothing over the ugly scars they had carved upon its face. He watched with a serene, detached satisfaction as the blemish of humanity began to fade, confident that the remaining humans, witnessing this effortless and absolute power, would simply fall into a state of despair and accept their silent, graceful end. He anticipated a quiet fading, a final, resigned sigh from a species that had realized the futility of its own chaotic existence. He could not have been more wrong. On the ground, the erasure was not a beautiful, healing light. It was a form of terror, so profound it defied the human capacity for understanding. Marcus Thorne, from a hardened subterranean command bunker hundreds of miles from the initial cleansing sites, watched the feeds from remote drones and satellite remnants with a growing knot of ice in his stomach. He saw the city of Port Meridian, a bustling coastal hub, simply vanish. There was no mushroom cloud, no shockwave, no screaming. One moment, the feed showed millions of people going about their lives. The next, there was only a shimmering haze over a newly barren coastline, the ocean already beginning to reclaim the land. The silence was the most horrifying part. It was a silence that swallowed screams, a silence that consumed history, a silence that left nothing behind, not even ruins to mourn over. Panic ignited across the planetary networks, a firestorm of terrified voices and garbled data. How do you fight a god who can unmake you with a touch? How do you shoot down a beam of light that isn't really light? How do you resist an enemy that doesn't want your land or your resources, but he simply wants you to not exist in the first hour? Thorne's command staff cycled through every conventional military doctrine. They launched atmospheric fighters, only to watch them dissolve into glittering dust the moment they entered the cleansing fields. They fired massive ground-to-air kinetic impactors, which were unwoven mid-flight, their immense momentum vanishing as their physical forms ceased to be. Every weapon, every strategy was predicated on the idea of interacting with matter and energy in a way the Lumina simply ignored. They weren't fighting an army, they were railing against a fundamental law of the universe that had just been rewritten to exclude them. It was in that moment of absolute despair, watching another city fade from the tactical map, that Thorne's mind broke free from the shackles of conventional warfare. The fury of a cornered animal, the raw, primal instinct to survive, superseded a lifetime of military training. He slammed his fist on the console, the display cracking under the force. "They want a clean canvas," he snarled, the words raw and guttural. "They want to erase us without a fuss." "Fine. We can't stop the brush, but we can sure as hell ruin the painting." A new kind of energy surged through the command bunker, not the disciplined focus of soldiers, but the wild, desperate creativity of a species with absolutely nothing left to lose. The objective was no longer to win, not even to survive in the traditional sense. The objective was to become an aesthetic poison. The objective was to become so profoundly, unforgettably ugly in their demise that the memory of them would scar the Lumina's perfect cosmos forever. The first new order was simple, yet monstrous. "Broadcast everything," Thorne commanded, his voice ringing with a chilling clarity. "Every channel, every frequency, raw, unencrypted. I want them to hear it all." Instantly, the silent and melodic chimes of the Lumina broadcast were overwhelmed by a tidal wave of human noise. It was the sound of a world dying. The screams of the terrified, the final, tearful messages between loved ones, the defiant, hate-filled curses of soldiers at their posts, the wailing of children, the roaring of fires, the screeching of tearing metal. It was a cacophony of raw, unfiltered emotion, a sonic assault of grief, terror, and rage. They pushed it out on every band, from simple radio waves to complex gravimetric pulses, hoping that somewhere in that spectrum of chaos, the serene consciousness of their enemy would be forced to listen to the ugliness they were creating. The Second Order was even more terrible. As the Lumina's cleansing light began to descend upon Argentis, the planetary capital and Haven's most populous city, Thorn keyed in the authorization for Protocol Ashfall. "If they want the city," he broadcast on a secure channel to the Argentis defense garrison, "they can have the fallout." Throughout the sprawling metropolis, a new kind of activity began. It wasn't an evacuation, it was a preparation. In the city's 50 fusion power plants, engineers began the process of a deliberate, catastrophic meltdown. In the vast subterranean geothermal wells, pressure regulators were disabled. In every military armory, every industrial fuel depot, every chemical processing plant, timers were set, and dead man switches were engaged. The people of Argentis, knowing their world was lost, made a collective soul and unspoken choice. They would not be erased. They would detonate. Aboard the Stellark, Lyra, the keeper of histories, monitored the sudden, jarring shift in the human data output. The chaotic flood of sound was dissonant. It grated against the harmonious sensibilities of the Lumina. Kalis dismissed it as the meaningless noise of a lesser life form in its death throes. But Lyra felt a flicker of something else. There was a structure to the chaos, an intentionality. She watched as the cleansing beams, a pattern of sublime, geometric perfection, began to converge on the central landmass where the city of Argentis stood. She expected the now familiar silent dissolution, another patch of the canvas wiped clean. Instead, what happened was a vulgarity. Just as the Lumina light touched the city's edge, the entire metropolis erupted. It was not the clean and beautiful, unweaving Kalis orchestrated. It was a violent, filthy, human explosion. 50 fusion reactors went critical simultaneously, herring a hole in the fabric of reality with pure, unrestrained energy. The planet's crust cracked as the geothermal wells blew, vomiting magma and superheated steam miles into the atmosphere. The resulting shockwave, a brute force physical phenomenon, slammed into the Lumina fleet. Their crystalline ships, designed to manipulate space-time, had no defense against something as crude as a concussive blast. Several of the smaller vessels shattered, their light forms fractured by the raw physical violence. Kalis himself felt the Stellark shudder, a jarring, physical impact that was utterly alien to his experience. A cloud of radioactive dust, vaporized metal, and scorched biomass billowed into the upper atmosphere, a permanent, ugly brown smear that blocked the starlight. From the command bunker, Marcus Thorne watched the seismic readings and radiation counters scream into the red. He had just sacrificed 12 million soul, but he had wiped the serene smile off a god's face. He had taken their clean, perfect art and smeared it with filth. Kalis stared at the view screen, his golden light pulsing with a feeling he had not experienced in millennia: annoyance. It was the feeling of an artist whose work had just been vandalized. The explosion was not a threat. In a military sense, the damage to his fleet was negligible, easily repaired. But it was an aesthetic affront of the highest order. It was ugly. It was loud. It was messy. The humans, in their final moments, had chosen to foul their own world, to scar the canvas he was trying to cleanse. He saw it not as a strategy whiz, but as a final, pathetic act of spite. "They are more like vermin than I imagined," he chimed, his tone losing its serene melody for the first time, replaced by a sharp, cutting edge, despoiling their own habitat as a final act of chaos. Very well. The cleansing will proceed with greater intensity. We will not give them time for such tantrums. He amplified the power of the cleansing beams, intending to scour the planet faster, to wipe away the ugly brown stain of the Argentis detonation and the lingering, screaming noise of the human broadcasts. He failed to recognize that the humans had just taught him their first lesson in a language he couldn't comprehend, the art of asymmetrical warfare. They had discovered his weakness was not a vulnerability in his shields, but a revulsion to their chaos. And they had a world full of chaos left to unleash. Lyra, however, saw something more. She isolated the energy signature from the Argentis detonation. It was a chaotic, discordant mess of frequencies, but within it, her sensitive consciousness detected a pattern. It was a crude, pulsing rhythm, a repeating sequence, a message. It was a mathematical representation of a prime number sequence, one of the universal languages of intelligence. The humans weren't just screaming. They were screaming. We are here. We are thinking, and we will not go quietly. They had turned their own self-destruction into a statement, a final, bloody piece of art that screamed defiance at the heavens. The garden, she realized with a chilling resonance, was not filled with weeds. It was filled with wolves that looked like weeds, and the Lumina had just tried to prune them with their bare hands. The aesthetic offense of Argenis' self-destruction fundamentally altered Kalis' perception. His serene detachment, the calm of a master artist at work, curdled into the focused ire of a perfectionist whose magnum opus had been defiled by a splash of crude, foul paint. The humans were no longer just a blemish to be erased. They were a contagion of ugliness, an active, malicious force of dissonance that sought to ruin the very canvas of existence. His response was immediate and absolute. The cleansing would no longer be a graceful unweaving of their works. It would be a total, elemental sterilization of their world. He would not just remove the scars. He would cauterize the planet until it was incapable of ever hosting such chaotic life again. A new directive, a sharp and discordant chord, pulsed from the stellarch. The cleansing beams intensified, their frequency shifting. They no longer targeted cities and infrastructure with sublime precision. Now, they plunged deep into the planet's oceans, vast columns of coherent light that bypassed the laws of thermodynamics, boiling the seas from the seabed up. The water did not simmer. It flash vaporized in a catastrophic chain reaction, sending continent-sized plumes of superheated steam into the sky. The planet's atmosphere, already choked with the radioactive soot of Argentis, was now saturated with a globe-spanning shroud of boiling water. Next, the beams turned to the skies, targeting the atmospheric shell itself. They focused on the delicate balance of nitrogen and oxygen, exciting the molecules to the point of spontaneous, sustained combustion. A ripple of fire, visible from orbit as a sickly orange wave, began to encircle the globe, consuming the very air the humans breathed. Kalis watched this planetary immolation with a cold, righteous fury. This was not the beautiful, silent erasure he had envisioned, but the humans had forced his hand with their vulgarity. This was cosmic sanitation, a necessary, if regrettably messy, act of purification. The screaming cacophony from their broadcasts was already weakening, choked off by the fire and steam. Soon, there would be only silence. In his subterranean fortress, buried deep beneath a mountain range on the planet's largest remaining continent, Marcus Thorne watched the world die. The feed showed oceans turning to steam and skies catching fire. The noise on the open channels was fading. replaced by the roar of a planet being torn apart. They had won their small victory, they had angered a god, but the price was annihilation on a scale he could scarcely comprehend. Yet, amidst the despair, a new, colder, and more calculated strategy was taking root. The detonation of Argentus was an act of passion, a primal scream of defiance. What came next had to be an act of purpose. "They hate our noise," Thorne said, his voice raspy in the tense quiet of the command bunker. "They hate our chaos." "They think we're just screaming as we die. They're not listening. They're just trying to turn down the volume." He looked at Dr. Eris Thorne, his estranged daughter and the lead xenolinguist on his staff. She wasn't a soldier, she was a thinker, and her eyes held not terror, but a terrifyingly intense focus. "He's right," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Their initial message wasn't language as we know it. It was a broadcast of pure aesthetic judgment. They aren't trying to communicate, they're trying to impose harmony. We responded with a tantrum. Now we have to respond with an idea, a virus. The final human stratagem, born in the dying heart of Haven, was named Project Legacy. It was humanity's last and most obscene act of defiance. Across the continent, in hidden silos and deep cavern launch sites, hundreds of small, crude sublight probes were being prepared. They were little more than hardened casings packed with antiquated fusion drives and a new, revolutionary form of data storage, crystalline memory matrices, etched at a quantum level with information. These weren't escape pods or weapons. They were coffins. They were messages in a bottle, thrown into a sea of fire. "What's the payload?" Marcus asked, watching the launch sequences light up his board. "Everything," Eris replied, her fingers flying across her console as she initiated the final data uploads. "Everything ugly, everything beautiful, everything that makes us human. We've compressed our entire recorded history. Every war, every genocide, every act of torture, the screams of the dying from 1,000 battlefields. We've included the philosophies of Kant and Nietzsche, the mathematics of Riemann, the symphonies of Beethoven, and the discordant noise of industrial metal. We've put in the blueprints for a fusion bomb right next to a mother's lullaby. We've encoded the hypocrisy of our politics, the fervor of our religions, the quiet desperation of our poetry, the wild joy of our celebrations, the depths of our cruelty, and the illogical, stubborn sparks of our compassion. It is the complete, unfiltered, contradictory, and profoundly ugly truth of what we are." "They'll just destroy them," Marcus countered, the pragmatist in him fighting against the desperate hope. "Exactly," Eris said, a grim smile touching her lips. "They won't see them as a threat. They'll see them as pathetic little lifeboats, more blemishes to be wiped away. But our probes won't try to fight. They will do the opposite. When their cleansing beam touches the casing, the probe's only directive is to fail catastrophically. The memory matrix is designed to shatter into a cloud of quantum entangled dust, and the final act of the probe's power core is to broadcast its entire compressed contents in a single, chaotic, omnidirectional burst, a data shriek. It will be the most dissonant, information-dense, and aesthetically offensive signal ever conceived. It won't destroy their ships. Dad, it will try to give them a migraine. We're not throwing rocks anymore. We're throwing our ghosts." The order was given. From the burning surface of Haven, hundreds of streaks of light clawed their way through the flaming atmosphere, pathetic little rockets arcing into the void. Aboard the Stellark, Kalis barely registered the launch. The planetary sensors chimed with the alert, but he dismissed it with a wave of his will. "Fleeing vermin," he chimed to his bridge crew. "A final, futile gesture. Erase them. Leave no trace of their chaotic energy in this system." His fleet, still methodically boiling the planet, began to pick off the probes one by one. As Eris predicted, the cleansing beams touched them, and they dissolved into silent, glittering motes of dust. For the Lumina, it was a trivial matter of cosmic sanitation. But Lyra, the keeper of histories, felt a jarring note in the symphony of destruction. Each time a probe was destroyed, her senses registered a spike of pure informational chaos, a blast of raw data so dense and contradictory that it was the conceptual equivalent of nails on a chalkboard. It was meaningless static to the others, but her scholarly mind recognized the ghost of a structure within it. It was too complex to be random noise. It was a scream. Yes, but it was an articulate scream, driven by a curiosity that bordered on transgression. She focused her own ship's sensors on a single, outbound probe, one that was streaking toward the system's edge. Before the cleansing beam could reach it, she extended a delicate tendril of her own consciousness, a fine-tuned sensor probe of pure light, and did something no Lumina had ever done before. She attempted to listen. She didn't just register the signal, she opened a direct conduit to the probe's memory core, intending to sample its contents. The instant the connection was made, her universe shattered. She was no longer a being of pure, harmonious light floating in a silent void. She was drowning. She was Marcus Thorne, feeling the bone-deep weariness of a hopeless war. She was a soldier on the fields of Verdun, choking on mustard gas. She was a mother in Hiroshima, shielding her child from a sun that had fallen from the sky. She was Mozart, composing a perfect requiem, and she was a serial killer, reveling in the discordant screams of his victim. She felt the searing hatred of a betrayed spouse and the boundless, illogical love of a parent for their child. A billion lifetimes of contradiction, of pain and joy, of soaring beauty and bottomless depravity slammed into her consciousness at once. She saw pyramids rising from the desert and bodies stacked like cordwood in frozen camps. She heard the Gettysburg Address and the whispered lies of a tyrant. She felt the thrill of scientific discovery and the sickening crunch of bone under a torturer's boot. It was a torrent, a flood, a deluge of raw, unfiltered existence. It was ugly. It was chaotic. It was terrifying. And woven through it all, in every memory, every piece of art, every historical record, was a single, unifying thread: the stubborn, irrational, and absolutely indomitable will to endure, to keep fighting, keep loving, keep hating, keep building, keep destroying, keep being, even in the face of absolute oblivion. The experience lasted for less than a microsecond before her own mind, unable to process the sheer volume of aesthetic and emotional contradiction, severed the connection. But the damage was done. The cleansing beam from a nearby ship vaporized the probe, but it was too late. Lyra, the keeper of histories, floated in the void, her lavender light flickering erratically. The perfect harmony of her being had been fractured. A human ghost was now inside her, a virus of pure, chaotic truth. She had looked into the blemish and found not a simple ugliness, but a universe of terrible, vibrant, and defiant complexity. And for the first time, Illumina understood the true nature of the enemy. They were not fighting a race. They were fighting the very concept of a soul. The interior of Lyra's consciousness was no longer a serene, resonant chamber of pure lavender light. It was a haunted house. The ghosts of humanity, unleashed from the shattered memory matrix, swirled within her, a chaotic tempest of sensation and emotion that was anathema to her very being. She felt the gnawing ache of hunger from a forgotten famine, the sharp, blinding joy of a first kiss under a sky of unfamiliar stars, the bitter taste of betrayal, the warmth of a hearth fire on a cold night. Whispers echoed in the perfect silence of her mind fragments of poetry, the maddening logic of a mathematical proof, the guttural roar of a drill sergeant, a child's nonsensical nursery rhyme. These were not memories she was observing. They were experiences she was having. A being of perfect harmony was being forcibly acquainted with the fundamental nature of contradiction. The human soul, she realized, was not a singular, harmonious note. It was a chord of infinite, dissonant string, and the tension between them was what created its terrible, vibrant music. The pain of it was exquisite, a pressure that threatened to tear her light form apart. But beneath the pain was a terrifying revelation. This chaos, this ugliness, this constant internal conflict was a more potent form of existence than the placid, unchanging harmony she had known for eons. It was dynamic. It was alive. This informational plague was not confined to Lyra. The data shrieks from the destroyed probes had washed over the entire Lumina fleet. For most, the effect was subliminal, a background static that introduced sour notes into their perfect symphony. A Lumina ship commander, flawlessly executing the sterilization of Haven's southern pole, might suddenly feel a flicker of something, a hesitation, a momentary pang that resonated with the immense, silent destruction it was causing. Another, weaving a pattern of fire across the upper atmosphere, would find its precise geometry marred by a sudden, inexplicable tremor, a momentary lapse in focus as a phantom echo of human grief brushed against its consciousness. They did not understand what was happening. They only knew that their perfect clarity, their divine purpose, was being clouded by a strange, emotional fog. The cleansing, once a silent and graceful ballet, became subtly clumsy. Beams wavered. Patterns lost their perfect symmetry. The fleet's collective harmony began to fray at the edges, like a perfect tapestry being unraveled by an unseen hand. Kalis, from the conductor's podium of the Stellarch, felt this dissonance as a physical violation. The sublime symphony of the cleansing was faltering, its tempo dragging, its notes falling flat. He could feel the wavering concentration of his subordinates, the subtle pollution of their harmonious thoughts. He had believed the humans' ugliness was confined to their physical presence, but now he saw the horrifying truth. It was a mimetic virus, a contagion of the spirit. Their chaos was infectious. They had weaponized their own messy, contradictory nature and thrown its ghost into the heart of his fleet. Rage, a purely human emotion he would have once found contemptible, now burned within his golden light, a searing, focused heat. "The contamination is deep," he chimed, his tone a razor-sharp discord that cut through the bridge. Their final act was not flight. It was a curse. They have spat their spiritual filth upon us. His new objective was terrifyingly clear. The sterilization of Haven was no longer enough. The planet itself was now just the source of the infection. He had to complete the physical cleansing, and then he would have to turn his attention inward and begin the spiritual cleansing of his own fleet. Every trace of this human dissonance, every flicker of empathy, every shadow of doubt would be scoured from the minds of his commanders until their perfect, harmonious obedience was restored. He would burn the ghost out of the machine, deep beneath the surface of the dying world. Marcus and Eris Thorne watched the last of their ghosts ascend. The bunker's sensors showed dozens of probes being vaporized, each one releasing its agonizing shriek into the void. But a few, a precious, desperate handful, had slipped through the faltering Lumina cordon. their weak sublight drives pushing them out toward the cold, dark gulf between the stars. The mission was complete. Haven was gone. The oceans had boiled away. The atmosphere was a self-sustaining inferno, and the crust was beginning to fracture under the strain of the Lumina's assault. The bunker shuddered, dust and rock raining down from the ceiling. Life support was failing. "Did it work?" Marcus asked, his voice low and heavy. He wasn't asking if they had survived. He was asking if their death had mattered. Eris stared at a flickering screen displaying the Lumina fleet. Their formations were subtly off. Their energy signatures, once perfectly stable, now showed erratic fluctuations. "They're listening," she whispered, a look of fierce, terrible triumph in her eyes. "We made them listen. They wanted to erase a blemish, and we forced them to read a book. A very, very ugly book. I don't know if it will save anyone, but they'll never be able to forget us. They can't unhear what we've screamed at them." Marcus reached out and took his daughter's hand. The years of professional distance between them melted away in the face of their shared end. They were no longer commander and doctor. They were just a father and his child at the end of all things. "Legacy," he murmured, the word tasting of ash and hope. The lights flickered one last time and died, plunging the bunker into a final, absolute darkness as the heart of their world gave way. Lyra felt their end. She felt the last human consciousness on Haven wink out, a final, defiant spark in the storm raging within her, and in that moment of silence, she understood. Kalis would not stop. He would hunt down the few escaped probes. He would purify his fleet, destroying any Lumina, like her, who had been too deeply touched by the human contagion. Humanity's only chance for its story to survive was in those fleeing coffins. The ghosts inside her, the billion contradictory voices of a dead race, screamed a single word: unified imperative, endure, sacrifice, live on. Her decision was instantaneous, a perfect logical conclusion born from the most illogical of human emotions, hope. With the last of her will, Lyra, the keeper of histories, a master weaver in her own right, turned her full attention away from the pain in her soul and toward the fabric of the cosmos. She reached out with her consciousness, not to fight Kalis, but to perform a final, monumental act of creation born from an aesthetic of pure, desperate function. She gathered the dozen or so probes that had escaped the inner system into a bubble of warped space-time. Then, she began to pull on the very essence of her being, the solidified light and energy that composed her, and poured it into a single, impossible equation. The Stellarch's sensors shrieked in alarm. Kalis turned his attention just in time to see Lyra's ship, the Chronicler, flare with an impossible brilliance. It was not exploding. It was blooming. "Treason," he hissed, the chime a blast of pure hatred. Lyra was sacrificing herself, using her life force not to attack, but to weave. She was creating a one-time, non-Euclidean gravitational channel, a slingshot of impossible power. The probes vanished from Kalis's sensors, hurled out of the system not at the pathetic speed of their drives, but flung across the galaxy like seeds cast upon a cosmic wind, their trajectories scattered and untraceable. Lyra's ship, its energy spent, collapsed into a silent, fading cloud of lavender dust. Kalis floated in the command center of the Stellarch, his golden light dimmed. Haven was a dead, glowing cinder. The battle was over. He had achieved a perfect, silent, sterile victory. But as he looked out at the empty void where the probes had been, he was consumed by a cold, burning dread. The physical blemish was gone, But the conceptual virus was now loose in the galaxy. His mission was no longer a simple cleansing. It was now a hunt, an inquisition. He would reforge his fleet not as artists, but as exorcists. He would hunt Lyra's ghosts to the edge of the universe and beyond. He would scour every trace of humanity's ugly, chaotic, and infectious memory from existence, even if he had to unweave 1,000 worlds to do it. The gardener had become a reaper, and his harvest had just begun. The immediate aftermath of Haven's incineration was not the quiet restoration Kahless had anticipated. Instead, a pervasive, low-level discord settled over the Lumina fleet, a subtle static in their collective consciousness. Each Lumina, a being of pure light and harmony, now felt a faint, phantom echo of human chaos, a residual vibration from the millions of data shrieks that had saturated their senses. It was like a constant, irritating hum in a perfectly tuned symphony, a single, coarse thread woven into the finest silk. Kahless, however, felt it most acutely. The golden brilliance of his form now pulsed with an unnatural, almost agitated rhythm. He was no longer the serene artist. He was the furious craftsman whose masterpiece had been defiled. His vision of aesthetic perfection had been violated, and the only path to restoration was not creation, but obliteration. His cleansing fleet became the exorcism fleet, its purpose shifting from silent erasure to violent, targeted eradication. The hunt for Lyra's ghosts began. The probes, propelled by Lyra's sacrifice, scattered across the vastness of the galaxy. They were not designed for speed or stealth, merely for endurance and broadcast. Each was a time capsule of contradictory human existence, silently humming its dissonant song into the void, a persistent, almost imperceptible irritant to the harmonious fabric of the cosmos. Most flew blindly, destined for the cold silence between stars, to be lost in the infinite. But a few, a desperate handful, drifted into the gravitational embrace of other inhabited systems, drawn by the currents of interstellar traffic. They did not land. They did not transmit targeted messages. They simply orbited, silent, inert, yet radiating their terrible cargo of truth into the electromagnetic and gravimetric ether. To any species with advanced enough sensors, they were anomalies, strange, resilient husks emanating a complex, chaotic, and utterly unintelligible data stream. The Lumina hunt was relentless, driven by Kahless's absolute certainty that the human plague had to be purged. The exorcism fleet, once a vision of graceful light and fluid movement, became a brutal engine of destruction. Their new methods were crude, efficient, and ugly. They did not unweave probes, they detonated them. They did not gently dissolve planetary anomalies. They scoured the surfaces with raw, unbridled energy, leaving behind craters and fields of slag. The Lumina, once revered by many nascent species for their elegant purifications and their cosmic artistry, now projected an image of volatile, unpredictable rage. In the outer rim, the exorcism fleet intercepted a probe near the burgeoning homeworld of the Sylvani, a sentient, arboreal species whose civilization was built on a delicate symbiosis with their living planets. The Sylvani, witnessing the Lumina's arrival, had initially bowed in reverence, expecting a display of sublime cosmic maintenance. Instead, they watched in horror as a Lumina vessel, its light form flickering with a new, aggressive crimson, violently detonated the tiny human probe, unleashing a small, localized burst of electromagnetic chaos that briefly fried Sylvani communications and disrupted their delicate planetary energy grids. The Sylvani elders, their consciousnesses a network of interconnected flora, felt the raw physical shock of the blast. An ugly cacophony that ripped through their tranquil, harmonious minds. They had seen cleansings before, but never like this. Never with such jarring force, such disregard for the collateral damage. A seed of fear, a very human kind of fear, was planted in the Silvani collective. Further still, in the distant Veil Nebula, the exorcism fleet engaged in a protracted, ugly conflict with the Cathar, a proud warrior race, over the possession of a system believed to harbor another probe. The Cathar, renowned for their discipline and code of honor, were accustomed to the Lumina's occasional, elegant interventions in galactic affairs, viewing them as aloof, if eccentric, deities. But this was different. The Lumina were fighting with a desperate, almost feral aggression, their crystalline ships ramming Cathar cruisers, their beams tearing through hulls with a savage disregard for collateral damage. The Cathar, who had always valued a clean, honorable fight, were repulsed by the Lumina's newfound brutality, their chaotic, unpredictable tactics. They saw the Lumina not as gods, but as maddened beasts, their once golden light now tinged with a furious, blood-red hue. The probe itself was eventually destroyed, but the Cathar had witnessed the unraveling of the Lumina's perfect harmony firsthand. They had seen their gods bleed, not physically, but spiritually, their once unblemished grace now stained with a desperate, human-like fury. The Cathar, in their warrior code, recognized a foe that had lost its way, and for the first time in their history, they began to prepare not for the Lumina's guidance, but for their madness. Kalis, at the heart of this galactic inquisition, was a twisted reflection of his former self. His golden light had faded to a dull, flickering bronze, scarred by jagged streaks of black where the human dissonance had permeated his very essence. His form, once fluid and graceful, had grown rigid, angular, like a broken sculpture of light. His thoughts were no longer a harmonious flow of cosmic artistry, but a single, burning obsession, the eradication of every last human ghost. He had sacrificed the very principles of the Lumina, harmony, elegance, non-interference in the physical, for his hunt. He had authorized the destruction of inhabited worlds if a probe was suspected to be present, leaving behind not pristine silence, but vast, ugly debris fields. He had even, in a moment of pure, raw rage, purged several of his own Lumina commanders whose forms had become too deeply tainted by the human contagion, unweaving them not with the elegant touch of his will, but with a surge of brutal, focused energy that ripped them apart. He was no longer a master weaver. He was a monstrous, cosmic exterminator, driven by a hatred born of violated perfection. The galaxy, once a neatly pruned garden under the Lumina's careful watch, began to shift. The Silvani, inspired by the brief, ugly burst of human data shriek, and terrified by the Lumina's new aggression, began to cultivate resilient, resistant forms of life. Species designed for survival in harsh conditions, species that mirrored humanity's own stubborn will to endure. The Cathar, their honor affronted, began to forge alliances with other warrior species, not for conquest, but for defense, building formidable fleets designed to counter the Lumina's destructive capabilities. Other, lesser races, once content to passively exist under the Lumina's benevolent, if aloof, guardianship, now looked up at the stars with a new, uneasy awareness. They saw the Lumina, their gods, descending into a brutal, self-destructive madness, all for the sake of eliminating a ghost. They heard whispers of a vanished species, humanity, whose final act had not been surrender, but a terrifying, inspiring defiance. The ghost of humanity, the very chaos Kalis sought to eradicate, began to spread, not as a physical presence, but as an idea, the idea that even the most powerful could be made ugly, and that the relentless will to survive was a potent force against any oppressor. Humanity, though physically gone, had created a new kind of awareness, a burgeoning spirit of resistance that was anathema to the Lumina's harmonious reign. Years bled into centuries. Kalis, a shadow of his former self, finally cornered what his sensors indicated was the last known human probe in the galactic plane. It was drifting in a desolate, forgotten corner of space, its fragile casing still radiating its silent, chaotic truth. His exorcism fleet was a fraction of its original size, its remaining Lumina commanders broken and corrupted, their light forms twisted into discordant shapes. The pursuit had cost them everything. As Kalis raised his will for the final, annihilating strike, a strange sensation overwhelmed him. It was not the pure, righteous rage he had cultivated for so long. It was a weariness, a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. And then, as if his own broken mind had finally mirrored the chaos it had hunted, he experienced it a flashback, not from the probe, but from the depths of his own corrupted consciousness. He saw Haven, not as a blemish, but as Marcus Thorne, watching his world die, his hand clutching his daughter's, the fierce, terrible triumph in his eyes. He heard the screams from Argentus, not as noise, but as Lyra, her perfect harmony shattering as she embraced the beautiful, terrible truth of human defiance. He felt the cold, burning dread of a species that had chosen not to kneel, but to burn. He saw his own golden light, once pristine, now scarred and jagged, a testament to the price of his crusade. He realized, in that final, agonizing moment, that he had become the very thing he sought to eradicate, a chaotic, ugly, destructive force, driven by a hatred that had consumed his own beautiful essence. His victory was not a restoration, it was a self-inflicted wound. He had won the battle, but humanity, in its dying breath, had corrupted the victor. He had cleansed the canvas, but stained his own brush with an indelible, ugly truth. Kalis unleashed his final, devastating blast, obliterating the probe, but the act brought him no satisfaction, only a profound, hollow emptiness. He floated in the silent void, surrounded by the remnants of his broken fleet, a monument to a hollow victory. Humanity was still gone, wiped from the physical universe, but their spirit, their indomitable, ugly, beautiful will to survive, had endured. It had been woven into the fabric of the galaxy, a subtle, persistent dissonance that would forever challenge the Lumina's reign of harmony. The galaxy was no longer a harmonious garden. It was a wild, untamed forest, vibrant with the lessons learned from humanity's defiance. The Lumina, diminished and broken, retreated into the deepest reaches of space. Their perfect harmony shattered, their aesthetic shattered, their reign of aesthetic perfection irrevocably tainted. They had tried to prune a weed and had instead awakened a wilderness. And in that wilderness, new species would thrive, armed with a new understanding that true strength lay not in perfect harmony, but in the chaotic, relentless, and utterly indomitable will to exist, no matter the cost. Humanity had not returned, but its ghost haunted the stars, an eternal testament to the price of underestimation.